The first thing I remember is the sound of my brother whispering my name. Not loudly, not urgently, just barely above a breath. "Mark, don't move." I was halfway down the narrow hallway of the cabin when he said it. The bedroom door was open just enough for me to see his face in the darkness. His eyes were wide and fixed on something behind me. Then he mouthed two words. "Behind you." And that was the exact moment I realized we weren't alone in the cabin. But the worst part was this. Neither of us had heard anyone come inside. This happened 4 years ago during a trip my brother and I took to western Wyoming. Every fall we tried to get away from the city for a few days and do some hiking. It was something we'd done since we were kids, and even though we were both in our 50s by then, neither of us had really grown out of it. My brother Daniel had found the cabin online. It belonged to a retired couple who rented it out during hunting season. The place sat about 20 miles outside a tiny town that barely had a gas station and a diner. After leaving the highway, we drove another 40 minutes down a gravel road through thick pine forest before finally reaching it. The cabin itself was simple but solid. 1 story, 2 bedrooms, a small living room with a wood stove and a long porch facing the woods. Behind it stretched miles of forest and low mountains, the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. That was exactly what we wanted. We arrived in the late afternoon just as the sun was dropping behind the mountains. The air had that cold, dry smell that only comes with early autumn in the Rockies. While Daniel carried our bags inside, I stood for a moment looking out over the tree line behind the cabin. Everything was quiet. Not silent exactly. There were birds somewhere in the distance and the wind moving through the pines, but quiet in the way that only remote places can be. No traffic. No people. Just wilderness. At least that's what I thought. That night we made a fire outside and cooked dinner over it. Nothing fancy, just steaks and a couple beers we'd picked up in town. We talked about the hikes we wanted to do over the next few days and joked about how much slower we were compared to when we were younger. By the time we went inside, it was fully dark. And I mean completely dark. There were no streetlights, no houses nearby. Once the fire died down, the woods around the cabin disappeared into pure blackness. Inside, the cabin felt warm and comfortable. We locked the doors out of habit, turned on a couple lamps, and sat talking for another hour before heading to bed. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I don't know what time it was. The room was completely dark except for a faint blue glow coming through the window from the moon outside. At first, I thought something had woken me. But when I listened, I didn't hear anything. Just the wind. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, we headed out early for a hike up a ridge about 6 miles away. The trail climbed steadily through the forest before opening up onto a rocky overlook where you could see miles of mountains in every direction. Took most of the day. By the time we got back to the cabin, we were both exhausted. Daniel said he was going to take a shower first while I sat down on the couch in the living room. The wood stove was still warm from earlier that morning, and I must have drifted off for a few minutes. When I woke up, something felt wrong. At first, I couldn't explain why. The cabin looked exactly the same. The lamps were still on. Daniel's backpack was on the floor near the door. But something in the air felt different. Then I realized something else. The shower wasn't running. Daniel had said he was going to shower almost 10 minutes earlier, but I hadn't heard the water pump start. I stood up and walked down the short hallway toward the bathroom. "Dan?" I called. No answer. I knocked on the door. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the bedroom door across the hall was slightly open, and someone was standing inside. At first I assumed it was Daniel, but something about the way the figure was standing made my stomach tighten. He wasn't moving. He wasn't saying anything. Just standing there in the dim light coming from the hallway. Then the figure slowly stepped backward deeper into the room. And that's when Daniel whispered from inside. "Mark, don't move." My brain froze because Daniel's voice wasn't coming from the figure in the doorway. It was coming from somewhere behind it. "Mark, listen to me," he whispered again. "Don't turn around." The fear in his voice made my chest tighten. I was standing in the hallway with my back to the living room, which meant whatever he was talking about was behind me. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Every instinct in my body was screaming to turn around, but something in Daniel's voice stopped me. Then he said the words I'll never forget. "There's a man standing in the kitchen." The kitchen was 10 feet behind me. I slowly looked down at the floor instead of turning. In the reflection of the polished wood I saw the outline of someone standing in the doorway to the living room, watching me. The man didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just stood there. In the reflection I could see one thing clearly. He was holding something in his hand. Daniel spoke again. "Mark, when I say run, run outside." The man behind me shifted slightly and the floor creaked. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. Then the man spoke. His voice was low and calm. "Don't do that." Everything happened at once. Daniel suddenly lunged forward from the bedroom and tackled the man from behind. The object in the man's hand clattered to the floor and slid across the wood. A knife. The man screamed and started fighting wildly. He moved like someone completely out of control, clawing, kicking, trying to grab the knife again. Daniel was stronger than him, but the guy was frantic and desperate. I grabbed a heavy metal fire poker from beside the stove and ran back down the hallway. The two of them were crashing into furniture and knocking chairs over as they struggled. "Get the door!" Daniel yelled. I didn't think. I swung the poker as hard as I could. It connected with the man's shoulder and sent him stumbling sideways. Daniel shoved him toward the front door and threw it open. Together we forced him outside. The man hit the ground hard in the dirt, then scrambled to his feet and ran straight into the trees. Within seconds, he disappeared into the darkness. Neither of us moved for several seconds. We just stood there breathing hard and staring at the woods. Finally, Daniel shut the door and locked it. The police arrived almost an hour later. They searched the surrounding forest but found nothing. No footprints, no vehicle, no campsite. But the next morning they called us with something strange. The knife the man dropped had a serial number. It had originally been part of a hunting set purchased by a man who had been reported missing nearly 6 years earlier. His last known location was a hiking trail just 3 miles from the cabin. The authorities never found that man, or the one who broke into our cabin. But sometimes I think about something else. When Daniel tackled him, the man had already been inside the house, and neither of us had heard the door open. Which means there's only one explanation. He had been inside the cabin before we even came home. The knocking started a little after midnight. At first it was soft. So soft that I thought I might have imagined it in my sleep. Just 2 slow knocks against the wooden door of the cabin. Then a voice came from the other side. "Thomas, you in there?" The moment I heard that name, my stomach dropped, because Thomas was my father's name. And my father had been dead for 3 years. I didn't answer right away. I was sitting in a chair near the wood stove, staring at the door while the fire crackled behind me. The cabin was deep in the woods outside a town that barely existed anymore. The nearest neighbor was probably 5 miles away. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. The man knocked again. "Thomas, it's me." His voice sounded older, rough, like someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door, stopping a few feet away from it. "Who is it?" I asked. There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if he had walked away. Then the man answered. "An old friend." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. This cabin had belonged to my father for nearly 40 years. He built it himself long before I was born. When he passed away, the property ended up in my name, but I hadn't visited it much since then. Truthfully, I didn't like coming here alone. It always felt too quiet, too isolated. But that fall I decided to spend a weekend fixing a few things around the place. The roof needed work and the porch steps were starting to rot. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip. Instead, I was standing inside a dark cabin at midnight with a stranger outside asking for a man who had been dead for years. "I think you've got the wrong place," I said through the door. Another pause. Then the man chuckled softly. "No, I don't." That answer made my chest tighten. "How do you know my father?" I asked. The man shifted his weight on the porch. I could hear the wood creak under his boots. "We worked together," he said. "A long time ago." I stared at the door. My father had worked a lot of jobs in his life. Logging, construction, even a few years driving trucks. It wasn't impossible that he had friends I didn't know about. But something about this situation didn't feel right. "How did you know he'd be here?" I asked. The man didn't answer immediately. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, less friendly. "I figured he never left." That response sent a cold wave through my stomach. "My father passed away," I said. The silence on the other side of the door lasted longer this time. Then the man spoke again, quieter. "Well, that's a shame." But the way he said it didn't sound like sympathy. It sounded like disappointment. The kind someone might feel when they arrive somewhere and realize their plans aren't going to work. "Listen," he continued. "It's freezing out here. Mind if I come in for a minute?" I didn't move. The fire behind me popped loudly in the stove. Outside, the forest was completely silent. "Sorry," I said. "I'm not comfortable opening the door." The man let out a slow breath. "You sure about that?" Something in his tone made my pulse start racing. "Yes," I said. There was another long pause. Then the man knocked again, this time harder. "Kid," he said. "I drove a long way to get here." I didn't respond. "Your father and I had unfinished business." The words hung in the air between us. "What kind of business?" I asked. The man laughed softly. "You really don't know, do you?" That question sent a chill down my spine. Because my father had always been a quiet man. He rarely talked about his past. There were entire decades of his life I knew almost nothing about. And now a stranger was standing outside in the middle of the night talking like he knew something I didn't. The man knocked again. "Open the door," he said. His voice had lost the friendly tone completely. It was flat now, demanding. I stepped back from the door. "No." For several seconds there was no sound from outside. Then suddenly the man slammed his fist against the door. The entire cabin shook. "Open it," he shouted. I grabbed the fireplace poker and held it tightly in both hands. "Leave," I said. The man laughed again. "You're just like him." The words made my stomach twist. "What does that mean?" I asked. But the man didn't answer. Instead, I heard his footsteps moving across the porch. Then the sound of him stepping down into the dirt. For a moment I thought he was leaving. But then I heard something worse. Footsteps moving along the side of the cabin, circling it. I rushed to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see outside. At first I saw nothing. Then a figure moved between the trees. The man wasn't leaving. He was walking around the house, checking the windows. I backed away slowly. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my chest. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller than it had earlier that day. And the woods outside felt much closer. The footsteps stopped somewhere behind the cabin. For nearly a minute there was no sound. Then something tapped lightly against the back window. I spun around. The curtain moved slightly as if something had brushed against it from outside. "Kid!" The man's voice called from the darkness behind the glass. "You should open the door." I didn't answer. "You don't want me coming in another way." My grip tightened around the poker. "You break in and I call the police," I said. The man chuckled again. "Out here." He wasn't wrong. The nearest police station was nearly 40 minutes away. If he decided to force his way inside, help wouldn't arrive in time. The tapping stopped. Then the footsteps moved again. Slowly, calmly. A few seconds later they returned to the front porch. The man knocked again. But this time it was different. 3 slow knocks, like someone who wasn't in a hurry anymore. "Last chance," he said quietly. I stayed silent. The knocking stopped. For nearly a full minute nothing happened. Then I heard something slide against the door. A scraping sound, like metal against wood. I realized what he was doing. He was testing the lock. My chest tightened as adrenaline rushed through my body. Then suddenly the door handle jerked violently. Once, twice, 3 times. The man started slamming his shoulder against the door. The entire cabin shook with each hit. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered as another crash shook the frame. "There's someone trying to break into my cabin," I said quickly. "Where are you located?" I gave them the address as best I could. Outside, the man slammed into the door again. The wood creaked loudly. "Sir, officers are on the way," the operator said. But we both knew they were far away. The door shook again. Then suddenly, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I stood there breathing heavily, staring at the door, waiting, but nothing happened. The operator kept talking on the phone, asking questions. Then something outside moved. Footsteps again. But this time they were walking away, into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night with the poker in my hands. When the police finally arrived hours later, the man was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. No vehicle, no footprints, no campsite, just empty forest. But before they left, one of the officers asked me something strange. What did he say his name was? I realized then that the man had never told me, but he had said something else. Something I hadn't thought about until that moment. "You're just like him." Later that day, while I was packing up to leave, I found something under the porch. An old, rusted hunting knife. The initials carved into the handle were familiar. They were my father's. And I suddenly understood something that made my blood run cold. That man hadn't come looking for my father. He had come looking for the person who had taken something from him. And judging by the knife, that person might have been my dad. The first time I heard the breathing, I thought it was coming from inside the walls. Slow, uneven, almost like someone trying to stay quiet. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling of my cousin's cabin at around 3 in the morning, trying to convince myself that what I was hearing was just the wind moving through the old wood. But then it happened again. A long inhale, right beneath the floor. That's when I realized something that made my stomach turn cold. The sound wasn't in the walls. It was coming from under the cabin. And whatever was down there was awake. This happened back in 2015 when I was taking a few months off from work after a divorce. I had spent most of my life living in Chicago, but after everything fell apart, I needed time away from the city. My cousin Rick owned a cabin deep in the forests of northern Pennsylvania and offered to let me stay there for a week or two. The place sat nearly 10 miles down a dirt road surrounded by thick hardwood forest. No neighbors, no traffic, just woods in every direction. Rick used it mostly during hunting season, so most of the year it sat empty. When I arrived that first afternoon, the isolation was exactly what I needed. The cabin itself was bigger than I expected. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a wide wooden porch that faced a clearing. The structure sat on short stilts, about 3 feet off the ground, leaving a narrow crawl space underneath. Rick had told me animals sometimes got under there during winter, but he said it wasn't anything to worry about. At least that's what I thought the breathing was at first. An animal. The first night passed without anything unusual. I made dinner, watched an old movie on the small TV in the living room, and went to bed early. The silence out there was something I wasn't used to. In the city, there's always noise somewhere. Cars, sirens, people. But out there, the forest swallowed sound. The second day, I spent hiking through the woods behind the property. There were old trails that Rick and his father had cut decades earlier, and I followed them for hours. It was peaceful, quiet, exactly what I needed. But later that evening something happened that made the entire trip feel different. I had stepped outside just before sunset to split some firewood when I noticed something strange near the back of the cabin. Footprints. They were faint but clearly human. At first I assumed they were probably Rick's from his last visit. But when I looked closer, I noticed something that didn't make sense. They were fresh. The dirt around them was still loose, like someone had stepped there recently. I stood there for a minute looking around the clearing. The forest beyond the cabin was thick enough that someone could easily stand a few yards away and remain completely hidden. But I didn't see anyone. Eventually I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe someone had wandered through the woods earlier in the day. Hunters sometimes passed through the area. Still, something about it bothered me. That night, I locked every door and window before going to bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. The room was dark and the cabin was completely silent. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound. Right beneath the floorboards. I held my breath and listened. The sound moved slowly from one side of the cabin to the other. Then it stopped. For nearly a minute there was no sound at all. Then came the breathing. Slow. Uneven. Like someone trying not to be heard. My heart started pounding. Animals didn't breathe like that. And whatever was under the cabin sounded too big to be a raccoon or a fox. I slid out of bed as quietly as possible and grabbed my phone. There was no cell service. The nearest signal was miles away. For several seconds I stood in the darkness listening. The breathing stopped. Then something lightly bumped the underside of the floor. I froze. Whatever was down there had just touched the boards directly beneath my feet. That was the moment the realization hit me. Someone was under the cabin. I backed away slowly and grabbed the hunting rifle Rick kept in the closet. The wood floor creaked under my weight, and instantly the sound beneath the cabin stopped. Complete silence. I stood there holding the rifle, staring at the floor. Then suddenly a loud thump hit the boards below me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Another thump followed. Then something started moving quickly beneath the cabin, crawling from one end to the other. The sound of hands and knees scraping against dirt. I rushed into the living room and turned on the porch light. Then I stepped outside. The clearing looked exactly the same as before. Dark forest on all sides. Cold air moving through the trees. But as I walked around the side of the cabin, I saw something that made my chest tighten. The crawlspace opening. Rick had covered it with a loose wooden panel to keep animals out. Now the panel was lying on the ground. Someone had moved it. I aimed the rifle toward the dark space beneath the cabin. "Who's there?" I shouted. For several seconds nothing happened. Then a shape moved in the darkness. A man slowly crawled out from under the cabin. He was thin, filthy, and looked like he hadn't shaved in months. His clothes were torn and covered in dirt. For a moment we just stared at each other. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Something strange and unsettling. Like he had been expecting me. "You're not Rick," he said. The calmness in his voice made my skin crawl. "No," I said slowly. The man glanced toward the forest behind me, then back at the cabin. "I've been staying here a while," he said. My grip tightened on the rifle. "Under the cabin?" He nodded casually. "Safer that way." My mind struggled to process what he was saying. "How long?" I asked. The man thought for a moment. "A couple months." The words made my stomach twist. That meant he had been living under the cabin long before I arrived. Watching the house. Watching the clearing. Watching anyone who came or went. "You need to leave," I said. The man tilted his head slightly. "What if I don't want to?" The forest behind him suddenly felt much darker. I realized something else then. The dirt around the crawlspace opening was covered with more footprints. Not just one set. Several. Like he had been going in and out many times. "I'm calling the police," I said. The man chuckled softly. "You don't have service out here." He was right, which meant he knew the area well. Too well. The man slowly stood up from the crawlspace. For a moment I thought he might rush me. Instead he just looked around the clearing. Then back at me. "You should probably leave," he said quietly. The words caught me off guard. "What?" He glanced toward the woods again. "They come around sometimes," he said. "Who?" I asked. But the man didn't answer. Instead he stepped backward toward the trees. Within seconds he disappeared into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night with the rifle beside me. The next morning I packed my things and left. When I told Rick what happened, he was shocked. He drove out there with a couple of local officers later that day. They searched the cabin and the crawlspace underneath. They found evidence that someone had been living there. Old food wrappers, blankets, empty cans, even a small lantern. But the man was gone. No one in the nearby towns matched his description. No missing person reports. Nothing. But a week later Rick called me with something that still keeps me awake sometimes. When they cleaned out the crawlspace, they found something buried in the dirt. Several old photographs. Photos taken from beneath the cabin. Pictures of the porch. Pictures of the clearing. Pictures of people standing outside the house. including one photo taken the afternoon I arrived. A picture of me unloading my car, taken from the shadows under the cabin, which means the man had been watching me the entire time, even before I stepped inside the house. And the worst part is something else he said that night. "You're not Rick." The way he said it sounded almost disappointed, like he had been waiting for someone else, someone he expected to come back, which means there's a very real chance that the man under the cabin wasn't waiting for me at all.